Now for tip number 5, we're going to leave our collections and our folders behind. We're going to move across to looking at some processing steps. So let's just find my selection that I made earlier, Iceland buildings. Now I've got one here that's Lightroom tips. I selected this earlier. Let's go back and look at this one. If we go across to the develop module, there's a couple of tips here that I will just explain to you. The first one is to be able to use the HSL panel in Lightroom to selectively add or subtract color. Now, one of the things that will often happen when you're looking at a landscape image is if you peak up the contrast and some of the other settings, you'll start to get a sky that gets a little bit overblown and looks a little bit too blue. Particularly for our friends in Europe, they never see a blue sky like this. But what we can do is we can go into the HSL panel, make sure you select saturation and select the little targeted adjustment tool. Click on that to select it, move over onto the image, and by holding down your left mouse button, drag downwards, you can reduce the saturation of just the blues, and you'll see over here that it's selected the blues. To remove the blues, or as you sometimes see, overblown blue saturation like that. So using that targeted selection tool, you can increase or decrease the saturation of selected parts of the image. And if you decide you didn't like that, rather than try and drag it back up and down, just simply double click on the word blue in the panel and it will reset it to 0. And you'll see here that there's a little bit of purple being reset. But let's look at the foliage in the image, and if I hold down my shift key, or my spacebar key, click to zoom in on the image, and let's say we wanted to increase the saturation of the foliage. One thing that you will see typically with vegetation is that it's not green, it's a mixture of green and yellow. And so if I click and drag on different parts of that image, you will see that some of it is more yellow and a little bit of orange creeping in, and some of it is a little more green. And then if I hold down the space bar again, click to zoom back out, you can see the effect. If I click on this little switch on the left of the panel, it will turn that effect on and off, and you'll see that there's virtually nothing happening here. But if you selectively decided you wanted to increase the saturation of particular colors, you could just click and drag on those parts. So using that selectively in the raw file is much more effective than trying to muck around later on in Photoshop and selectively adjust colors. You don't have the range of colors you can adjust. And of course you can do the same thing with the luminance of particular colors. If you click on the luminance slider rather than the saturation slider, you can adjust the luminance of different parts. Now we can make all of the green and yellow areas lighter as well as more saturated. You can see here that mostly that's yellow that's been increased in brightness, or we could look at those, and by clicking on that building, because it's mostly blue, you'll see that it's shifted the aquas and the blues in luminance. We don't really want this. We could drop the luminance of the sky though, but as you see, as we drop the luminance, it tends to look a lot more saturated, so we'd need to go back to our saturation and drop that back a little bit too. And let's just have a look at how that appears before and after. All of a sudden the emphasis is now on the foliage and not the buildings, and if we turn that off, our eye is taken further on into the buildings. So this is a powerful tool that we can use in Lightroom before we go further into Photoshop. Now for tip number 6, here's a way to save a lot of time in processing, especially when you use a number of things repetitively in your images. Let's just take, for instance, the basic panel. Often I will apply a set amount of clarity and vibrance to an image as a basic step, and we might even add a little bit of texture. And I do that pretty much on every image. So rather than come into the basic panel and push each of these sliders along, we can make a preset, and we can make a preset that includes as few or as many steps as you would like to make as a standard application onto an image. So let's have a look at how we do that. With some settings already made, So we head across to the user presets panel, and to do that we get to the top where we see the plus symbol. We want to add a new preset. It'll be create a preset, and this menu panel will drop up and it's going to appear under the user presets panel, and we'll call this texture, clarity and vibrance. And here we choose which settings we're going to apply. So basically let's turn them all off by checking none, and the only ones we want to include in this preset are going to be things like texture, clarity, and somewhere in here is vibrance. So we just tick those, and of course the process version ought to be ticked because that's going to be important. And all we then do is click on the button to create the preset. And if you look down into the presets, there's a whole lot of presets here that I've imported from other people, but here's my texture, clarity and vibrance. And let's just go to another image and see how those presets work. Let's just pick on an image that we can then make a virtual copy, so that then we can reset that copy and apply the presets. This is an image taken in southwestern Tasmania. Go into the develop setting and let's click on reset to reset all of those to the base settings. You'll see nothing here. If we come across to our preset texture, clarity and vibrance, just click on that once and you'll see there that our texture, clarity and vibrance settings have been applied to the image. And you can make up as many presets as you would like. I've imported a whole lot of presets here from various other people, some of them which are great, some which are pretty awful, but you can just slide over these and you'll see a preview of how it's going to look in your main view. So there's lots of different ways you can do things. Applying presets and saving them speeds the process up a lot. And another advantage of having presets is when you come to import an image, you can actually apply presets from here. Apply during import. I've got nothing to import at the moment, but if we go down to develop settings, we can come down to user presets and we can choose, well, I want to apply that to every image as I import it. That saves me a lot more time. I can do that as I go. So that's the power of using presets. Tip number 7. Have a look at using different color profiles for your images before you start processing. In the develop module, you will see under the heading of the basic panel the different profiles, and normally it would be selected to Adobe Standard, but there are a number of other choices here. For instance, if you went for Adobe Vivid, it makes quite a different effect on the image, sometimes a little bit over the top. Or what about Adobe Landscape? It punches up slightly different colors. They're all fairly subtle, but there are slight differences between them, and one or other might be more appropriate for your image. So that's worth playing around with before you start trying to enhance and treat the colors in the way that you'd like to have them. Tip number 8. In addition to manually adjusting sliders or using presets, we can also experiment using Lightroom's advanced auto settings to see how it affects our image. Now in this image I've reset all the settings back to 0, and we can access the advanced auto settings by using the words that apply to each of the adjustments, holding down the Shift key and double clicking on each of these in turn will allow Lightroom to apply its auto settings, and we'll see how that works for the image. Now I've just done this on those adjustments. It doesn't work on the present sliders, so we'll just manually adjust those. But you can see here that with the adjustments it's moved the histogram so that our exposure has been increased a little bit, and we're not clipping any whites. Let's just double check that by holding down the Alt key and adjusting the white slider. You'll see that it's just verging on clipping in one tiny little area, which is probably quite acceptable. And the same with the blacks. If I hold my mouse on the black slider and hold down Alt and click my left mouse button, you can see that we've just got a little bit of clipping to black, and that seems entirely appropriate. Now that's not a bad starting off point, and then we could play around with other settings such as your different color profiles, different amounts of vibrance and so forth. But using the advanced auto settings can give you a good start towards getting your image looking the way it probably should do. And of course, that's not to say that that's where you should finish your adjustments, but that's a good place to start. And of course, you can go into doing selective changes and really getting things to look the way you want to. But doing those advanced basic settings can really speed up the initial processing. Tip number 9 relates to finding and fixing things like chromatic aberration and dust spots on our images. Now, if you ever change the lens on your camera, you're going to find you have dust spots. And here's an example. If I zoom in here, you can see that there's one dust spot. And if I come back out and click over here, here's another dust spot. But when we go into the spot removal tool and click on the visualization option, yes, you can certainly see the spots. But if we zoom back out, you'll see that it also highlights a whole lot of other things, and it can be difficult to really find and identify all of those nasty spots. So here's another way to visualize those spots without having to turn that on. With our visualize spots turned off, if we go back into the basics panel and increase the dehaze amount, we will soon see that even without the visualize spots turned on, we can clearly see the dust spots that we need to remove. So let's just do these. Click and remove. Let's go back in over here. We saw that one. We'll get rid of that one. And let's have a look. Are there any others that are a problem? We can just scan across the image. Well, here's another one that probably wouldn't have been visible without that, so we can do this. And if there's one dust spot, there's a pretty good chance there's going to be more. So using this technique of increasing the dehaze amount, you can easily see the spots without having to turn that visualization off and on. And the other aspect that this is really good for is for finding and eliminating chromatic aberration. Here's a couple of more spots. We'll just eliminate those. And what we find is when we reduce the dehaze amount, of course it'll reduce the effect. And you can see here that sometimes the spot removal doesn't really do a terrific job. And that's sometimes because the spot's way too big, and sometimes because it just gets it a little bit wrong. So let's do that again. That looks much better. If we come back to our original image, and if we come back over into the corner now, you'll see that particularly with wide angle lenses, when this thing stops jumping around, even with the profiles in place, you can see, and let's go into 200% just to magnify this a little more, wide angle lenses, you often get a bit of chromatic aberration. Now, turning the profile amounts on here, you'll see that it's corrected a lot of that, but there's still a little bit visible. So again, with our dehaze amount increased, you can see it more clearly. And if we come back down to our lens correction tool, go to the manual option and choose the eyedropper, you can then clearly identify the green fringing in the image, and it will remove pretty much all of that. And it can't find it. If there's not enough there to find, it won't be able to find it. So let's just have a look at another area. That looks like it's pretty much gone, and we can go back. And then once you're all finished, return the dehaze back to normal, and our image is done. and that can save a lot of time and avoid having to go backwards and forwards with the visualize spots tool, and sometimes you even miss a few spots. So that's our tip number 9. Tip number 10, and this last tip is where a lot of people get themselves tied in knots and get into all sorts of trouble. What happens is we've taken our image, processed it in Lightroom, gone to Photoshop, and then saved it back out as a Photoshop file. And then we look at it back in Lightroom and decide, well, I'd like to do some further tweaks to it. So we might do a little bit more and play around with a few settings, and let's just do something a little bit crazy here so we can see the difference. We've done something a little bit different, looks quite terrible, but this is just to illustrate the example. We've now done this and we want to go back into Photoshop and do some further work. So we right mouse click and we go edit in Photoshop. Now the problem is our image is already a Photoshop file or a TIFF file. So what do? Well, we've got 3 options. We can edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments, which means that these adjustments that we've just made will be applied to a copy of the image, and we can go into Photoshop. But the problem is all of your layers in Photoshop will be lost because the copy image has all the layers flattened, and then we have these adjustments applied, and we basically have lost all the work we've done. Or we can edit a copy of the original file, and if you read the fine print, Lightroom adjustments will not be visible. So what we've just done in Lightroom is not going to be visible, so that's no good to us. Or we can edit the original, and again, any adjustments we've done in Lightroom will not be visible. So what do? Well, the golden rule is if you've made an image in Lightroom, taken it into Photoshop, and then saved it as a TIFF or a Photoshop file, to do any further editing, you take it back into Photoshop, do the adjustments, and then resave it. Do not do any further adjustments in Lightroom, because then you'll be stuck with a problem. You'll have to make a copy of the file that will lose your layers and all your previous adjustments, or you open a copy without the adjustments visible, so you've wasted your time anyway. So the golden rule is with a Photoshop or a TIFF file, once it's been edited in Photoshop, you only ever re-edit it in Photoshop. Save it back in here, and let's just do that. I'm going to go in, edit in Photoshop, and I'm going to edit the original, remembering that we've made some pretty horrible adjustments to this image, and we'll go now into Photoshop with the original file, and it will open now in Photoshop. And of course all those adjustments we made in Lightroom are not visible because we've opened the original file, and those things are not visible. So if we wanted to make any further adjustments, let's say we wanted to adjust the color balance of the image, we could tweak things around here and warm things up a little bit or whatever, and then with those adjustments made, you then resave the file and it appears back in Lightroom with those adjustments. That's our top 10 tips for Lightroom. I hope you enjoyed this, and come back and visit soon, and we'll have some more videos very shortly.